The Forgotten Lake. My family has always had its peculiarities. I grew up hearing stories that blurred the line between reality and superstition, stories most people would dismiss as myths or exaggerations. But there was one tale that was never treated as a joke: the story of the Forgotten Lake. The Forgotten Lake was a remote place, miles away from the nearest town, hidden deep in a dense forest. According to my grandparents, our family once owned a cabin nearby, and summers were spent there fishing, swimming, and enjoying the peace. That was until the tragedy that befell my great-grandfather, Samuel. Samuel was a practical man, one who had little patience for foolish superstitions. Maybe that's what led him to camp by the lake alone one night, ignoring the warnings from the locals. They said the lake was cursed, especially when fog rolled over its surface on still, quiet nights. No one knew exactly why, but they all avoided the lake when the mist appeared. Samuel, of course, ignored all of that. That night, a thick fog enveloped the lake, covering everything in a shroud of white. Samuel, ever the pragmatist, laughed it off and set up camp anyway, preparing to spend the night. It was only when complete silence fell over the area that he started to feel uneasy. And then he heard it. It was a low sound, almost like a whisper, coming from within the fog. "Leave," the voice said, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. Samuel, thinking it was just his imagination, ignored it, but the whisper persisted, growing louder, clearer. "Leave now." The story goes that the next morning, Samuel was found on the shores of the lake, drenched and wide-eyed with terror. He never spoke of what happened that night, but something inside him changed. He was no longer the confident, practical man everyone knew. He avoided the lake after that, and never camped there again. When asked about it, he would simply shake his head and say, "There are things in that lake we can never understand." The stories that followed Samuel's tragedy marked the end of any activity near the Forgotten Lake. For years, no one dared go near it, and it became a place forgotten by the rest of the world. But in our family, it never truly disappeared. It remained a whisper, a shadow lurking in the back of our minds. Every now and then, someone would mention hearing strange sounds coming from the lake, or seeing that same eerie fog rolling in. No one camped there anymore, not even during the day. To me, growing up, the lake was more myth than reality. My parents rarely talked about it, and when they did, it was in hushed tones, as though mentioning it could summon something dreadful. It was an unspoken rule that none of us, especially the children, should ever go near the lake. Naturally, though, unspoken rules tend to have the opposite effect. It was during a particularly hot summer, when I was 17, that everything changed. I was with my cousins, Nathan and Emily, and we decided to do something no one in the family had done in decades: visit the lake. The forbidden visit. We weren't planning on staying long, just a quick visit to satisfy our curiosity. I still remember the chill that ran down my spine when I suggested the idea. Nathan and Emily hesitated at first, but the combination of heat, boredom, and the allure of doing something forbidden won us over. The path to the lake was overgrown, as though nature itself was trying to conceal it. We passed through tall trees and dry branches that scratched at our skin, adding to our unease. The closer we got, the quieter everything became. The sound of birds and insects vanished, and all we could hear were our own footsteps. When we finally reached the lake, we were struck by how still it was. The water lay undisturbed, reflecting the clear sky above like a mirror. There was nothing visibly threatening about it, just a forgotten lake. But there was something in the air. A weight. As if the lake itself was waiting. "Is this it?" Nathan asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. Emily shrugged, and I too felt that the place didn't seem as dangerous as the stories had made it out to be. But then, something changed. Without warning, a mist began to rise, creeping out from the water like unseen fingers, spreading quickly and surrounding us. And then we heard it. The voice that called it was the same voice my great-grandfather had described, a low, distant whisper, coming from all directions. "Leave." This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't our imagination. It was real. Nathan tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained. "It's just the weather. Shifting," he said, but I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt. The voice repeated itself, louder this time, more urgent. "Leave now." Emily was the first to step back, her eyes wide. "We need to go," she whispered, and in that moment, we all knew it was time to leave. But before we could move, something emerged from the water. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't an animal. It was a figure, a shadowy form, with long hair floating like underwater weeds and eyes that glowed faintly. It was distant, yet its presence was suffocating. It was as though the lake itself was watching us, judging us, waiting. The figure didn't move toward us, but the fear it inspired was enough to make us run. We ran without looking back, our hearts pounding, the whispers from the lake still echoing in our ears. The return to silence when we got home. No one talked about what happened. There were no words that could capture what we had seen, what we had felt. But we all knew that something had changed. The forgotten lake wasn't just a myth, and the spirit that haunted it was no longer content to be ignored. My parents sensed something was wrong, but they didn't push. That night, I struggled to sleep. I dreamt of the figure in the lake, of the whispers that seemed to come from right outside my window. The silence of the house, normally comforting, felt heavier, denser. Nathan and Emily changed too. In the days that followed, they became quieter, more withdrawn. We didn't talk about the lake, but we all knew that the memory of it haunted us. The family's fate, strange things started happening in the months that followed. Nathan was the first to fall ill. The doctors couldn't explain it. He was always tired, always weak. No tests revealed anything physically wrong. But day by day, his energy drained away. Soon, Emily began having constant nightmares. She said every night she heard the lake calling to her, asking her to return. I tried to distance myself from it all, but the whispers followed me too. On the quietest nights, I could swear I heard the sound of water lapping against the shore, even though we were miles from the lake. And more than once, I dreamt of that shadowy figure, watching me from within the mist, waiting. Nathan's death, the whispers and dreams grew more intense, until one morning, Nathan couldn't get out of bed. He looked pale, more frail than ever, his eyes hollow. I visited him that day, and as we talked, he confessed that the voices were getting louder, more insistent. "They don't stop," he said. "It's like they're calling me all the time, even when I'm awake." The doctors were baffled, unable to diagnose what was happening. His condition worsened, and he began speaking of the lake more frequently, as though it was pulling him back. "Whatever it is, it won't stop until I return," he told me one night as I sat beside his bed. I tried to reassure him that it was all in our heads, that the whispers and dreams were just our minds playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Nathan passed away on a quiet night, in his sleep. There was no pain, no visible suffering, but the expression on his face was that of someone who had finally found what they were looking for. It was as if, in the end, he had surrendered to the call of the lake. Emily disappears. Emily vanished a few weeks after Nathan's funeral. That night, she was restless, pacing back and forth. She hadn't been talking much lately, but that night, something was clearly bothering her. When I asked what was wrong, she looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I need to go to the lake." I tried to convince her that it was madness. After everything that had happened, the lake was the last place any of us should go. But it was as though she had no choice. "It won't stop until I go back." She repeated the same words Nathan had spoken. The next morning, she was gone. I ran to the lake, dreading what I might find. The mist hung thick over the water, just like it had the first day we visited. And through that mist, I saw a familiar figure standing on the shore. It was Emily, standing at the edge of the lake, staring into the water. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I tried to reach her, but before I could, the mist swallowed her whole, and then she was gone. The curse of the lake time has passed, but the lake still haunts me. I've tried to move on, to build a normal life far from the tragedies that marked my family. But no matter how hard I try, the forgotten lake is always there, lurking in my memories. The feeling that something is still unresolved has never left me. Objects that belonged to Nathan and Emily began appearing in strange places around the house. Emily's coat, which had disappeared the day she vanished, suddenly folded neatly over a chair. Nathan's pocket watch, which was buried with him, reappeared in my drawer as if it had never left. The whispers became more frequent too. Sometimes they weren't just at night, but in the middle of the day. I'd hear that familiar voice while I was at work or walking down the street, always soft but unmistakable. "Come back to the lake." One night, as I looked out my bedroom window, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. There, at the edge of the forest, something shimmered, like moonlight reflecting on water. But there was no water there. At least, there wasn't supposed to be. It was as if the lake was expanding, creeping closer, surrounding me. The weight of its call became unbearable. Now, I sit here, writing all of this down, knowing that my time is coming to an end. I know that, just like Nathan and Emily, I will be the next to succumb to the call of the forgotten lake. And when it happens, I hope someone will read these words and know the truth. The lake is always waiting, always watching. And when it calls, there is no escape.